Could I see my husband's will? I asked quietly after the funeral dinner. My daughter-in-law Vanessa froze. Then a nursing home file slipped from her purse onto the floor. My name was on it. Admission date, 3 days later. My own son looked away when I picked it up. That was the moment I realized they weren't grieving Edward, they were replacing me. But what Vanessa didn't know was that Edward changed his will 2 months before he died, and hidden inside his lawyer's office was one final message meant only for me. The truth I uncovered the next morning destroyed my family forever. Could I see my husband's will? I asked quietly, and my daughter-in-law started shaking so hard she dropped the nursing home papers right onto the dining room floor. That was the moment I realized Edward's death wasn't the only thing being hidden from me. I'm 71 years old, and until 2 weeks ago, I believed I had a good family. Not perfect. No family ever is. But I believed in loyalty. In love that lasts beyond funerals and casseroles brought by neighbors and sympathy cards stacked neatly on a piano. I believed that after 43 years of marriage, my husband would never leave me unprotected. I was wrong about some things. But not about Edward. The dining room still smelled faintly of rosemary and coffee from the funeral gathering earlier that afternoon. Half-empty cups sat scattered across the mahogany table Edward had spent 3 months restoring by hand after we found it at an antique shop in Vermont back in 1989. I remember him sanding the edges in our garage every Sunday morning while old jazz records played through the radio. That table had seen birthdays, graduations, Thanksgiving dinners, and once, 22 people squeezed around it during a Christmas snowstorm when the power went out and we ate by candlelight. Now it felt cold. Too polished. Too quiet. Vanessa sat across from me in a cream sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. Her blonde hair was perfectly curled despite the rain outside, and her lipstick hadn't faded once all day. I noticed strange things after Edward died. Tiny details I would have ignored before. The way Vanessa never cried unless someone was watching. The way my son Daniel kept checking her face before answering simple questions, as though he needed permission to speak. The way conversations stopped when I entered a room. You should get some rest tonight, Margaret, Vanessa said softly, folding her napkin with delicate fingers. This house is too overwhelming for you right now. Too overwhelming. I almost smiled at that. I had lived in that house for 36 years. I knew every creaking floorboard, every stubborn cabinet hinge, every draft that slipped through the upstairs hallway in winter. I knew exactly where the afternoon sunlight landed in the kitchen around 4 o'clock, because Edward used to stand there making iced tea every summer afternoon. But somehow, according to Vanessa, I was suddenly too fragile to exist inside my own life. Daniel cleared his throat beside her. Maybe Vanessa's right, Mom. You've been under a lot of stress. Stress. Such a clean little word for grief. I looked at my son carefully. At 42, Daniel still had the same blue eyes he'd had as a little boy, but something inside them had changed over the years. Or maybe I'd simply stopped wanting to see it. I'm managing just fine, I replied quietly. Vanessa gave me a tight smile. Of course you are. But she said it the way people speak to children or patients recovering from surgery. Patient. Careful. Condescending. The rain tapped softly against the dining room windows. Somewhere upstairs, the grandfather clock Edward inherited from his father chimed 7 times. I suddenly realized nobody had mentioned Edward in nearly an hour. Not his funeral. Not his kindness. Not the fact that he had spent 43 years building the life we were all sitting inside. Everything felt strangely rushed, as if everyone wanted to move on before the ground settled over his grave. Vanessa reached for her wine glass, but her hand trembled slightly. Tiny. Barely noticeable. I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching her so carefully all evening. That's when I asked the question. Could I see Edward's will? Silence. Absolute silence. Vanessa froze. The color drained from her face so quickly it startled me. Daniel looked down at his plate. And then it happened. Her fingers slipped. The wine glass tipped sideways, dark red liquid spilling across the white tablecloth, while a thick manila folder slid directly from her purse onto the hardwood floor beside my chair. I stared at it. Large black letters stretched across the front. Silver Oak Senior Living Community. My name was printed underneath. Margaret Whitmore. Intake assessment scheduled Monday, 10 a.m. Monday. 3 days from now. For a moment, nobody moved. I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Rain tapping the windows. My own heartbeat somewhere deep in my chest. Vanessa lunged for the folder first. "That's private," she said too quickly. Too sharply. I picked it up before she could reach it. My fingers suddenly felt cold. Inside were forms. Medical questionnaires. Medication checklists. Financial authorization pages. There was even a brochure showing smiling elderly couples playing cards beside a fireplace that looked nothing like home. "What is this?" I asked quietly. Daniel rubbed his forehead. "Mom," Vanessa stood abruptly. "We were going to talk to you about it later." Later. As if there was a gentle way to tell someone they'd already planned where she'd be stored after her husband died. I turned another page. Someone had already filled out portions of the paperwork. Emergency contact, Daniel Whitmore. Primary decision maker, Vanessa Whitmore. Estimated property transition timeline, 14 days. 14 days. That was how long they expected me to remain inside the house Edward built with me before they removed me from it completely. My hands remained steady somehow, though inside me something cold and terrible had begun unfolding. Vanessa crossed her arms defensively. "Margaret, please don't make this emotional. We're trying to help you. Help me." I looked at her carefully then. Really looked at her. Not as my son's wife. Not as family. But as a stranger sitting inside my dining room calculating how quickly my life could be packed into boxes. "You arranged this before Edward was even buried," I said softly. Daniel stood up suddenly. "Mom, that's not fair." Fair. Another clean little word. Vanessa stepped closer to him immediately, placing one manicured hand against his arm. Ownership disguised as comfort. "Daniel only wants what's best for you," she said. I noticed she still hadn't answered my question about the will. "Where is Edward's will?" I asked again. Vanessa swallowed hard. Just for a second, I saw genuine panic flicker across her face. Tiny, but real. And that frightened me more than anything else. Because guilty people panic when simple questions are asked. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "The lawyer still has some paperwork to organize." "Edward organized everything years ago," I replied. My husband labeled tax returns from the 1990s in alphabetical order. He wouldn't leave legal documents unfinished. Neither of them spoke. I slowly closed the nursing home folder and placed it carefully back onto the table. My grief suddenly felt different now. Sharper. Clearer. Like fog lifting off dark water. Edward used to tell me something whenever we watched old detective movies together on Sunday nights. "People reveal themselves in small moments, Maggie," he'd say. "You just have to pay attention when they think nobody's looking." Vanessa wouldn't meet my eyes anymore. Daniel looked exhausted. Guilty. Weak. And in that heavy silence, sitting at the same table where my husband once held my hand during family dinners, I realized something that chilled me far more than the nursing home papers ever could. This plan had started long before Edward died. And somehow, my husband already knew it was coming. I did not sleep that night. The house sounded different after everyone left. Too quiet in some places. Too loud in others. Every little sound seemed sharper now. The refrigerator humming in the kitchen. The old pipes rattling faintly behind the walls. Rainwater dripping steadily from the gutters outside my bedroom window. I lay awake staring at the ceiling Edward painted himself 12 years ago after a storm leak ruined the original plaster. He had climbed that ladder despite his bad knee because he said hiring someone else would take all the pride out of it. I could still picture the white paint streaked across his glasses while he laughed at himself in the mirror afterward. I pressed my hand against the empty side of the bed beside me. The sheets were cold. That was the cruelest thing about grief. It was never only emotional. It became physical. The silence beside you at night. The untouched coffee mug in the morning. The absence of footsteps in the hallway. 43 years beside someone creates habits your body cannot unlearn overnight. Around 2 in the morning, I finally got out of bed and walked downstairs wearing Edward's old navy cardigan over my nightgown. The hardwood floors creaked softly beneath my feet. I paused outside his office door. Closed. Locked. My stomach tightened immediately. Edward had never locked that room. Not once in all the years we lived there. Even when Daniel was a curious teenager sneaking through drawers looking for Christmas presents, Edward simply laughed and said, if he finds them, he earns them. But now the brass doorknob would not turn. I stood there for a long moment staring at it in the dim hallway light. Then I noticed something else. The filing cabinet inside the office had been moved slightly. Just enough for me to see scrape marks across the hardwood floor beneath the door. Someone had been searching through Edward's office. Quietly. Recently. I backed away slowly. My pulse had started beating harder now, though my face remained calm. Edward used to say panic makes people blind. The moment you panic, Maggie, you stop noticing things. So I forced myself to notice everything. Vanessa's shaking hands. Daniel refusing eye contact. The nursing home paperwork already completed before anyone spoke to me. The locked office. The missing will. None of it felt random anymore. I walked into the kitchen and switched on the small lamp above the stove instead of the overhead light. The warm yellow glow spread softly across the counters Edward remodeled himself 5 summers ago. He insisted on installing every cabinet personally, even though it took him twice as long as the contractor estimated. This house matters because we built it together, he told me while measuring countertops with a pencil tucked behind his ear. I suddenly missed him so fiercely it nearly bent me in half. But underneath the grief now was something colder. Something sharper. Fear. Not fear of being alone. I could survive loneliness. Women my age learned long ago how to survive difficult things quietly. No. What frightened me was the realization that people I trusted had already begun rearranging my future without my permission. I opened the refrigerator absently and saw the casserole dishes neighbors had dropped off after the funeral. Labels written in careful handwriting covered the lids. With sympathy. Thinking of you. Sending prayers. Real kindness from strangers while my own family planned where to place me next. I closed the refrigerator door gently and noticed an envelope sitting near the fruit bowl on the counter. My name was written across the front in Vanessa's handwriting. Margaret. Inside was a brochure for Silver Oak Senior Living Community. There were smiling gray-haired couples holding coffee mugs on a sunlit patio. One woman watered flowers while another played piano in a recreation room. Peaceful. Clean. Artificial. A yellow sticky note was attached to the front. Thought this might help ease the transition. Love, Vanessa. Love. I stared at that word for a very long time. Then I folded the brochure neatly and placed it back on the counter. At 6:30 the next morning, I heard footsteps upstairs. Vanessa always woke early. She claimed yoga helped her stay centered, though I had never met a truly centered person who monitored everyone else's life so carefully. I remained in the kitchen making coffee when she entered wearing expensive cream-colored workout clothes and carrying her phone. She stopped immediately when she saw me already awake. "You're up early," she said carefully. "Could not sleep," I replied. She hesitated before walking toward the refrigerator. I watched her reflection in the microwave door rather than turning directly toward her. People reveal more when they think you are not studying them. "About last night," she began softly, "Daniel and I only want what is best for you." I poured coffee slowly into Edward's favorite mug, the dark green ceramic one with the chipped handle he refused to throw away because he claimed it fit his hand perfectly. "Interesting," I said calmly. "Most people ask before deciding what is best for someone else." Vanessa opened the refrigerator but did not remove anything. "You are grieving. We understand this is emotional." Emotional again. Another tidy little word designed to shrink someone's instincts into irrationality. I finally turned toward her. "Where is Edward's will?" Her jaw tightened almost invisibly. "The lawyer still has documents to finalize." "Which lawyer?" Silence. Just for 1 second. But long enough. "Mr. Carmichael," she answered finally. Wrong. Edward's attorney for nearly 20 years had been Martin Keller. Not Carmichael. I took a slow sip of coffee without reacting. Vanessa noticed nothing. Liars often become careless once they think age makes you slow. "I may call him myself later," I said quietly. Her expression changed immediately. Tiny panic flickered behind her eyes before disappearing beneath another polished smile. There is really no need to stress yourself with legal matters right now. Legal matters. My husband's final wishes reduced to paperwork inconvenient for her schedule. Upstairs, I heard Daniel moving around our old guest room where they had stayed since arriving for the funeral. He used to run downstairs every Saturday morning as a child asking Edward to make pancakes shaped like baseballs. Edward always pretended to complain while secretly loving every second of it. Somewhere along the years, my son had become someone I no longer recognized. Or perhaps someone I had refused to recognize. Vanessa checked her phone quickly. I caught a glimpse of a message preview before she tilted the screen away. Did she sign anything yet? My stomach turned cold. Vanessa slipped the phone into her pocket too quickly. I have a yoga class in an hour, she said brightly. Maybe later today we can discuss options calmly. Options. Such a polite word for removing someone from her home. After she left the kitchen, I remained very still, holding Edward's coffee mug between both hands. Outside, morning sunlight finally pushed through the rain clouds, casting pale gold streaks across the backyard Edward loved so much. He planted every rosebush himself. 27 in total. He knew every variety by name. Suddenly, a memory surfaced so clearly it startled me. 3 months before his death, Edward stood beside those roses trimming branches while speaking unusually quietly. If anything ever feels wrong after I am gone, he said without looking at me, promise me you will not ignore your instincts. At the time, I laughed and told him he sounded dramatic. He only smiled sadly and changed the subject. I understand now why he did. By noon that afternoon, the house no longer felt like mine. It is difficult to explain how quickly a familiar place can become unfamiliar once trust disappears. The same sunlight still spilled across the kitchen counters. The same clock still ticked above the fireplace. Edward's roses still swayed gently outside the dining room windows beneath the warm spring breeze. And yet everything felt altered somehow, as though invisible hands had already begun removing me from my own life piece by piece. Vanessa spent most of the morning whispering on the phone in the den. Every time I entered the hallway, her voice lowered immediately. Once, I heard my name followed by the words timeline and documents, before silence swallowed the conversation completely. Daniel avoided me entirely. I found him twice standing alone in Edward's old workshop behind the garage, staring blankly at shelves full of tools he never learned to use. Edward had always hoped they would work together more after Daniel became an adult. He bought matching fishing rods one Christmas when Daniel turned 25. They used them exactly once. I remembered Edward pretending not to care afterward while quietly storing Daniel's rod in perfect condition beside his own. Some fathers spend their lives loving sons who slowly drift beyond reach. Around 1 o'clock, Vanessa announced she was running errands and left in her silver SUV wearing sunglasses, despite the cloudy sky. I watched from the front window as she backed down the driveway while speaking into her phone before the car even reached the street. Daniel remained upstairs. The moment the house fell silent. Again, I walked directly to Edward's office. The brass doorknob still refused to turn. I stood there staring at it for several long seconds before kneeling carefully beside the doorframe. Edward used to hide spare keys in absurd places because he claimed burglars never think creatively. Once he taped a house key beneath an old gardening magazine in the garage simply because nobody under 70 reads gardening magazines anymore. My eyes drifted toward the hallway table beside the staircase. A ceramic bowl sat there filled with loose batteries, pens, old receipts, and random objects collected over decades of family life. My pulse quickened slightly as I crossed the hallway and searched through it carefully. Beneath an expired coupon booklet and a flashlight battery, my fingers brushed cold metal. A small brass key. I closed my hand around it immediately. The office door unlocked with a soft click. I stepped inside slowly. The room smelled faintly of cedarwood and Edward's aftershave. For one painful second, I almost expected him to be sitting behind the desk wearing his reading glasses low across his nose while balancing financial records the way he always did every Thursday afternoon. Instead, the room stood empty. Too clean. Too organized. The filing cabinet drawers were slightly open. Papers inside looked disturbed, not messy exactly, but handled. Searched. Someone had tried very hard to put everything back neatly afterward. I moved toward Edward's desk carefully. His fountain pen still rested beside a yellow legal pad covered in his handwriting. Seeing those familiar slanted blue ink letters nearly unraveled me. Grocery reminders. Insurance notes. A phone number for the irrigation company. Tiny ordinary details from a man who no longer existed anywhere except memory. My fingertips rested lightly against the edge of the desk. If anything feels wrong after I am gone, his words echoed through my mind again. Slowly, I opened the top desk drawer. Empty except for paper clips and envelopes. The second drawer held old tax records. The third contained family photographs. One picture stopped me immediately. Daniel at age 8 holding a trout beside Lake Champlain, while Edward knelt proudly beside him grinning into the sunlight. I sat down heavily in Edward's leather chair and stared at that photograph for a long time. Families do not collapse all at once. They erode slowly, quietly, through years of overlooked moments and unanswered disappointments. Somewhere along the line, Vanessa had learned exactly how to separate my son from the people who loved him most. And Daniel, weak in all the ways Edward never wanted him to be, had allowed it. A faint buzzing sound interrupted my thoughts. I looked down. Edward's old desk phone displayed one missed voicemail notification. Strange. The landline had barely rung since cell phones became common. I pressed the playback button carefully. Static crackled softly before a familiar male voice filled the room. Edward, it is Martin Keller. I reviewed the revised documents. Everything is protected exactly as requested. Call me when you can. Revised documents. My heart started beating harder immediately. Martin Keller. Not Carmichael. Vanessa lied. I replayed the message twice more. Then a second realization struck me. The voicemail was dated 6 weeks ago. Only 3 days before Edward's heart attack. My hands tightened against the armrests of the chair. Edward changed something shortly before he died. Something important enough to involve legal protection. Suddenly, footsteps creaked upstairs. I froze instantly. Daniel. He moved slowly across the hallway overhead. Then silence again. I lowered the voicemail volume and stood carefully from the desk. My eyes scanned the room with sharper focus now. Edward had hidden something here. I knew it. Not because of instinct alone, but because I knew my husband. He planned everything. Vacation routes. Retirement savings. Storm preparations. Christmas gift lists written 6 months early. Edward Whitmore did not revise legal documents days before his death unless he believed something was wrong. I began checking the bookshelves one by one. Accounting manuals. Gardening guides. History biographies. Then my fingers paused against an old leather-bound copy of The Count of Monte Cristo, Edward's favorite novel. He reread it every summer for nearly 20 years. Something felt strange immediately. The book was heavier than it should have been. I opened it carefully. The center pages had been hollowed out. Inside rested a small silver flash drive. My breath caught sharply. Edward. Even now, he was still thinking 3 steps ahead. I stared at the flash drive resting inside the hidden compartment while a cold realization settled deep inside me. My husband knew exactly who Vanessa was before any of us did. And somehow, he had been preparing for this long before he died. Upstairs, I heard another floorboard creak. Daniel was moving again. I quickly slipped the flash drive into the pocket of my cardigan and returned the book carefully to the shelf exactly as I found it. By the time Daniel appeared in the hallway downstairs a few minutes later, I was calmly wiping dust from the kitchen counter with a dishcloth. He looked exhausted. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. Have you seen Vanessa? He asked quietly. Out running errands, I replied. He nodded absently before opening the refrigerator. I watched him carefully. He looked nervous. Guilty. Lost. But beneath all of it, I also saw fear. Not fear of me. Fear of something unraveling. Your father trusted Martin Keller, I said casually while folding the dishcloth. Daniel froze almost imperceptibly with the refrigerator door still open. What? His lawyer, I continued softly. He trusted him completely. Daniel shut the refrigerator too quickly. Right. Just one word. Tight. Controlled. Wrong. I smiled faintly to myself then, though he did not notice. Because for the first time since Edward died, I finally understood something clearly. They were not afraid of my grief. They were afraid of what Edward left behind. That evening, Vanessa cooked dinner for the first time since arriving at the house, and somehow that unsettled me more than if she had ignored me entirely. Vanessa never cooked unless there was an audience for it. During holidays, she preferred ordering catered meals from upscale restaurants and transferring them onto serving platters while casually accepting compliments she did not earn. Edward used to joke quietly that Vanessa could burn water and still blame the stove. Yet there she was at 6 o'clock standing in my kitchen preparing lemon chicken and roasted asparagus as though we were some normal grieving family trying to heal together. The smell filled the house warmly, almost convincingly domestic. If a stranger walked through the front door, they might have mistaken us for a loving family weathering loss together. That was the dangerous thing about people like Vanessa. They understood appearances better than truth. Daniel set the dining room table silently while avoiding my eyes again. I noticed he placed only 3 plates now. Edward's usual place at the head of the table remained empty for the first time in decades. No folded napkin. No water glass. No reading glasses absent-mindedly left beside his plate. Just empty polished wood beneath the chandelier light. I stood in the doorway for a moment staring at that space while grief moved through me in slow, heavy waves. Edward always carved the chicken himself during Sunday dinners. He claimed nobody else sliced properly. The knife had to angle gently. Thin cuts. Steady pressure. Patience matters more than force, he always said. I wondered suddenly if he realized how often he spoke about life without meaning to. Vanessa carried dinner dishes to the table with exaggerated care. I thought we could all use a peaceful evening, she said softly. Peaceful. Another carefully selected word. Everything Vanessa said sounded polished beforehand, as though she rehearsed emotions instead of feeling them naturally. We sat down together beneath the low amber glow of the chandelier Edward installed himself after our 20th anniversary. He spent an entire weekend wiring it because he refused to pay an electrician $300 for work I can learn myself. I remember standing on the ladder beside him holding screws while Frank Sinatra played through the old kitchen radio. It amazed me sometimes how grief could make ordinary memories feel brighter than the present itself. Vanessa served everyone carefully before finally sitting across from me. Daniel barely touched his food. His fork moved aimlessly through asparagus pieces while his knee bounced beneath the table in nervous rhythm. Vanessa noticed immediately and rested one manicured hand gently against his arm. Control disguised as comfort again. Daniel has been under enormous stress, she said quietly. Everything has fallen on his shoulders. I took a small sip of iced tea before answering. Your father carried this family for 40 years without making it look like a burden. Daniel flinched slightly. Vanessa's smile tightened almost invisibly. Tiny moments. Tiny reactions. Edward was right. If you watched carefully enough, people always revealed themselves. Rain had started falling again outside. Soft, steady drops tapped against the dining room windows while distant thunder rolled somewhere far beyond the hills. The house felt sealed off from the world, suspended in something heavy and unresolved. Vanessa folded her napkin carefully before speaking again. Margaret, perhaps tomorrow we should visit Silver Oak together. Just to look. There it was. Finally spoken aloud openly at the dinner table where my husband once laughed so loudly during family stories that neighbors could hear him through open windows. I set my fork down gently. No, silence followed immediately. Daniel rubbed his forehead again. Vanessa kept her voice unnaturally calm. You should at least keep an open mind. I said no. She studied me carefully then. Measuring. Recalculating. Living alone at your age can become dangerous very quickly. Dangerous. The words settled coldly into the room between us. I looked directly at her for the first time all evening. Interesting, I said softly. Edward lived here alone for 3 days while I visited my sister in Maine last summer. Nobody considered him dangerous. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Vanessa's expression hardened before smoothing itself again almost instantly. That is not what I meant. But it was exactly what she meant. Old. Fragile. Inconvenient. Removable. I suddenly understood something clearly then. Vanessa did not hate me personally. That would have required emotional investment. No. To Vanessa, I was simply an obstacle standing between her and the life she believed she deserved. The house. The accounts. The property. Control. People like Vanessa viewed family the way investors viewed assets. Useful until inconvenient. The storm outside intensified slowly. Wind rattled faintly against the windows while shadows flickered across the dining room walls. Daniel finally spoke after several long minutes of silence. Mom, maybe this house really is too much now. His voice sounded tired. Defeated. Practiced. I looked at my son carefully. Somewhere underneath the gray stress lines around his eyes and the exhaustion pulling at his shoulders, I still saw traces of the little boy who once cried for 2 straight hours after accidentally stepping on a bird's nest in the backyard. Daniel used to be gentle. Sensitive. Edward worried constantly that the world would harden him too easily. Instead, another person had done it for him. Your father built this house for us, I replied quietly. Not for resale. Vanessa reached immediately for her wine glass. Too quickly. Nobody is talking about resale. Another lie. I heard it in the speed of her answer. In the way Daniel suddenly stared down at his plate again. In the invisible panic that seemed to move between them whenever money entered the conversation. My pulse remained steady now. Strange how fear eventually transformed into clarity once enough pieces aligned. How much debt are you in? I asked calmly. The question landed like broken glass across the table. Daniel looked up instantly. Vanessa froze completely. There it was again. That tiny flicker of terror before her expression reset itself. Excuse me, she asked carefully. You heard me. Rain hammered harder against the windows now. Somewhere upstairs, the old pipes groaned softly through the walls. Daniel looked pale suddenly. Mom, that is inappropriate. Is it? I folded my napkin neatly beside my plate. Because people planning to remove a widow from her home usually have financial reasons. Vanessa laughed softly then, but the sound felt brittle. Hollow. You are being paranoid. Paranoid. Emotional. Fragile. They kept reaching for words that reduced instinct into weakness. Edward warned me about that once too. Manipulative people always attack perception first, he said years ago after a business partner cheated him during a land negotiation. If they can make you doubt your own judgment, the rest becomes easy. I rose slowly from the table carrying my untouched plate toward the kitchen sink. Behind me, silence stretched heavily across the dining room. Neither of them followed immediately. I rinsed dishes carefully beneath warm water while thunder rolled louder outside. Then I heard it. Vanessa's whisper. Sharp. Furious. I told you she would notice. My hands paused briefly beneath the running water. Daniel answered too quietly for me to hear everything clearly, but one sentence reached me through the silence. What if she talks to Keller? Keller. Not Carmichael. Confirmation. I continued washing dishes slowly as though I heard nothing. But inside me, every instinct sharpened further. Because now I knew 2 things with certainty. First, Vanessa lied about the lawyer intentionally. And second, whatever Edward changed before his death terrified them both enough to panic at the mere possibility of me discovering it. Later that night, after everyone went upstairs, I sat alone in the darkened living room holding the silver flash drive tightly inside my cardigan pocket while lightning flickered faintly beyond the backyard trees. Edward's favorite armchair still faced the fireplace exactly where he left it. A folded blanket rested neatly over one arm beside the mystery novel he never finished reading. I stared at that chair for a very long time. Then quietly, almost without realizing it, I whispered into the empty room, "What did you leave for me, Edward?" Outside, thunder rolled again across the dark sky. And somewhere upstairs, I heard footsteps pacing nervously above my head. The next morning, Vanessa acted cheerful. That frightened me more than her anger ever could. People become strangely calm when they believe control is slipping back into their hands. I watched her move around my kitchen humming softly while pouring organic granola into a ceramic bowl she once mocked me for buying at a local craft fair. Sunlight streamed through the windows behind her, catching the diamond bracelet Edward gave me on our 30th anniversary now, dangling casually from her wrist. She wore it as though it already belonged to her. "You should try to eat something this morning," she said brightly. "You barely touched dinner last night." I stirred cream slowly into my coffee. I slept fine. Another lie. I had spent most of the night staring at the silver flash drive hidden beneath loose tissues inside my bedside drawer, too afraid to plug it into my laptop while Daniel and Vanessa remained in the house. Edward was careful. If he hid something that deliberately, there was a reason. Vanessa sat across from me at the kitchen island, crossing one elegant leg over the other. "Daniel has a meeting this afternoon," she said casually. "I thought maybe you and I could visit Silver Oak afterward." There it was again. Persistent. Controlled. Like someone gently pushing furniture toward the edge of a cliff 1 inch at a time. "No," I answered calmly. She smiled without warmth. "Margaret, I understand this transition is emotional." Emotional. Always emotional. Never rational. Never observant. Never dangerous. I realized suddenly that Vanessa's greatest mistake was believing age automatically created weakness. She saw me as outdated, slow, sentimental, invisible. But women my generation learned survival differently than hers. We learned it quietly, through years of swallowing discomfort to keep peace inside households that depended on us emotionally while rarely acknowledging it openly. We noticed everything because noticing was how women survived disappointment long before people started discussing it publicly. The back door opened suddenly. Daniel entered carrying a cardboard box from the garage. He looked exhausted again. His clothes wrinkled. His eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. "Found more of Dad's files," he muttered while setting the box beside the dining room wall. Vanessa stood immediately. Too quickly. "I can organize those later." Organize. Another careful word for searching. I watched Daniel wipe sweat from his forehead while glancing briefly toward the box. Nervous again. "Actually," I said quietly, "I may look through them myself first." Silence settled instantly across the kitchen. Vanessa recovered first. "There is probably nothing important there." "Then you should not mind me checking." Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside the counter. Vanessa folded her arms. "Margaret, with respect, legal paperwork can become confusing." Confusing. I almost smiled into my coffee cup. Edward used to say manipulative people repeated the same tactics because they worked on most of the world. Dismiss. Minimize. Reframe. Control. "Interesting," I replied softly. Edward trusted me to manage our finances for nearly 20 years after his bypass surgery. Vanessa said nothing. Because she knew I was right. Every tax return. Every mortgage payment. Every insurance policy. Edward hated paperwork. He always joked numbers made his eyes cross after 45 minutes. I handled everything quietly while he built businesses and landscaped gardens and spent Saturdays teaching neighborhood boys how to repair bicycles in our driveway. People underestimated homemakers because they misunderstood invisible labor. Vanessa excused herself shortly afterward to take a call upstairs. The moment she disappeared, Daniel released a long breath through his nose and sat heavily at the kitchen table across from me. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The refrigerator hummed softly nearby. Somewhere outside, birds fluttered through Edward's rose bushes beneath the warm morning sun. Finally, Daniel rubbed his tired eyes and whispered, "Mom, please do not make this harder than it already is." Harder. I studied my son carefully. There was genuine strain in his face now. Fear too. But underneath it all remained something else. Shame. "Your father changed something before he died," I said quietly. Daniel's head lifted immediately. Tiny reaction. Instant. "What do you mean?" "Too fast. Too defensive." I folded my hands calmly atop the kitchen table. "Interesting question. Most people would ask what changed." His jaw tightened. "Mom, what are you afraid of?" He stood abruptly then, chair scraping harshly across the tile floor. "Nobody is afraid." Another lie. Weak people always deny fear while radiating it physically from every movement. Before I could answer, Vanessa's voice floated down the staircase. Daniel? We should leave soon. He looked toward the stairs immediately, almost instinctively. Obedient. My heart broke quietly inside me then. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just the slow, painful grief of realizing your child became someone else's reflection long ago. Daniel grabbed his car keys from the counter. We will talk later, he muttered before walking quickly toward the front door. Vanessa appeared halfway down the staircase, watching us both carefully. Measuring the room. Calculating damage. Everything okay? She asked lightly. Daniel nodded too fast. Fine. She smiled at me then. Polite. Controlled. Predatory beneath the softness. We will not be long. I listened to their SUV disappear down the driveway before moving immediately toward the dining room box. Old folders filled with property records, utility statements, business receipts, and insurance forms sat stacked inside. Edward labeled everything meticulously in black marker. Landscaping contracts. Property taxes. Vehicle titles. I searched carefully for nearly 40 minutes before finding something unusual buried beneath old bank statements. A plain white envelope with no label. My pulse quickened slightly as I opened it. Inside rested photocopies. Nursing home brochures. Real estate evaluations for our house dated 2 months earlier. Estimated market value highlighted in yellow ink. Attached beside it was a handwritten note in Vanessa's slanted handwriting. If Margaret transitions by summer, listing before fall market could maximize value. My fingers went cold. Transition. Not move. Not relocate. Transition. Like I was a scheduling inconvenience instead of a human being mourning her husband. Beneath the papers rested something even worse. A credit report. Vanessa's name across the top. Outstanding debt balances circled heavily in red pen. Credit cards. Personal loans. A second mortgage against their condo I never knew existed. Total balance due, $283,000. I stared at the numbers while understanding settled over me fully for the first time. This was never about concern. Never about caregiving. Never about family support after grief. They needed money. Fast. Money. And Edward's death created opportunity. My hands trembled only once before becoming completely steady again. Because suddenly every strange moment from the past 2 years rearranged itself into clarity. Vanessa pushing Edward to discuss downsizing repeatedly. Daniel asking unusual questions about trust funds during Christmas dinner. The pressure to update estate documents. The subtle attempts to isolate me from financial conversations. It had all been happening slowly. Carefully. Long before Edward died. A sharp knock startled me from the front door. I quickly returned the papers exactly as I found them before crossing the hallway cautiously. Through the stained glass window beside the entrance, I saw an older man standing neatly in a charcoal suit holding a leather briefcase. My breath caught instantly. Martin Keller. Edward's attorney. And judging by the grim expression on his face, he already knew something was very wrong. Martin Keller looked older than I remembered. Grief does that to people, even those standing outside the tragedy itself. His silver hair was thinner now, and deep lines framed his mouth beneath the steady professional calm he had worn for as long as I had known him. Edward trusted Martin completely. They played golf together every September for nearly 15 years despite neither man being particularly good at it. Martin always claimed Edward spent more time discussing irrigation systems and property taxes than actual golf swings. Seeing him standing at my front door with rainwater darkening the shoulders of his charcoal coat sent a strange wave of relief through me so suddenly I nearly reached for the wall to steady myself. "Margaret," he said quietly as I opened the door. "May I come in?" His voice carried none of the false softness Vanessa used whenever she pretended concern. Just directness. Respect. I stepped aside immediately. Martin entered slowly, removing his glasses to wipe rain droplets away with a folded handkerchief. His eyes moved carefully across the foyer as though checking whether we were alone. "Daniel and Vanessa are out," I said before he could ask. Something shifted in his face then. Not surprise. Concern. "Good," he replied quietly. That single word tightened every nerve inside my chest. I led him into Edward's office without speaking further. The moment Martin stepped through the doorway, his expression changed completely. Sadness softened him visibly. His fingertips brushed lightly against the bookshelf near Edward's desk. "I still expect him to walk in complaining about fertilizer prices," he murmured faintly. For one painful second, both of us simply stood there inside the silence Edward left behind. Then Martin placed his briefcase carefully onto the desk and looked directly at me. "Margaret," he said quietly, "did Edward ever tell you he revised his estate documents before his death?" I held his gaze steadily. "Only indirectly." Martin nodded once, almost as though confirming something privately to himself. "Then I need you to listen carefully." My pulse quickened, but outwardly I remained still. Women my age learned long ago that calm, unsettled, dishonest people far more than tears ever could. Martin opened his briefcase slowly and removed a thick sealed envelope marked private and confidential in Edward's handwriting. Seeing those familiar blue ink letters made my throat tighten instantly. Edward always wrote in precise block print whenever something mattered deeply. Martin rested one hand over the envelope, but did not slide it toward me yet. 3 months ago, he began carefully, Edward requested a complete revision of his will, property protections, and financial authority assignments. 3 months. Around the same time Edward began growing quieter at dinner. Around the same time Vanessa suddenly became unusually interested in family planning conversations about retirement. I felt cold realization settle deeper inside me. Martin continued. "At first I assumed it was routine estate updating. Many couples your age make adjustments after health concerns arise. But Edward was unusually specific." "Specific how?" I asked softly. Martin hesitated briefly. "He believed someone was attempting to manipulate access to family assets." The room became perfectly still. Outside, rain tapped softly against the office windows while distant thunder rolled faintly. Somewhere beyond the hills. "Did he say who?" Martin removed his glasses slowly. "Not directly." Edward was careful. But he repeatedly expressed concern regarding pressure from within the family. "Vanessa." Even hearing it implied aloud sent something sharp through my chest. Not because I doubted it anymore, but because Edward carried those suspicions alone while protecting me quietly behind the scenes. Martin slid the envelope toward me carefully. "He instructed me to give you this personally if anything unusual occurred following his death." My fingertips rested against the envelope, but I did not open it immediately. "What qualifies as unusual?" Martin looked at me steadily then. "Has anyone attempted to relocate you? Restrict access to financial records? Pressure you regarding the house?" I almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. Not because it was funny. Because Edward had predicted everything so precisely it no longer felt real. "They filled out nursing home intake paperwork before the funeral flowers were gone," I replied quietly. Martin closed his eyes briefly. Genuine anger flickered across his face before disappearing beneath professional restraint. "I was afraid of that." "You knew?" I suspected. He lowered himself into the chair across from Edward's desk slowly. "Margaret, 6 weeks before Edward died, Vanessa contacted my office directly requesting copies of trust documentation." My stomach tightened instantly. "On what grounds?" "She claimed Daniel needed assistance understanding future estate responsibilities." Martin's expression hardened slightly. "When my office refused disclosure without Edward's authorization, she became persistent." Persistent. Another polished word hiding uglier behavior beneath it. I thought of Vanessa smiling softly across my kitchen island while wearing my anniversary bracelet around her wrist. Martin folded his hands carefully. Edward found the request deeply troubling, particularly because he had not discussed estate transitions with Daniel yet. "Did Daniel know she contacted you?" Martin paused too long before answering. "I do not believe so." Something inside me cracked quietly then. Not dramatically. Just the dull ache of realizing how thoroughly manipulation had spread through my son's life. Daniel was weak, passive, easily influenced. But I still believed he had not fully understood what Vanessa planned. At least I wanted to believe that. "There is more," Martin said carefully. My eyes lifted toward him immediately. He removed another folder from his briefcase. Inside were copies of property transfer inquiries, preliminary home valuation requests, nursing facility correspondence. Every page connected somehow to Vanessa. These began approximately 2 months ago, Martin explained quietly. None authorized by Edward. I stared at the paperwork while rage moved through me slowly and coldly, like winter water beneath ice. Not explosive rage. Worse. Controlled rage. The kind that sharpened perception instead of blinding it. She was preparing before he died, I whispered. Martin's silence answered me before words did. I looked toward Edward's empty chair beside the office window. Suddenly, I understood his sadness during those final months differently now. He knew something poisonous had entered the family he spent 43 years building. And instead of burdening me during his illness, he quietly prepared defenses alone. There is one final thing, Martin said softly. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small folded note. Edward asked me to memorize this instruction specifically. My throat tightened painfully. Martin unfolded the paper slowly before reading in Edward's familiar measured voice. If Margaret ever begins doubting herself, remind her she notices more than anyone in this family. I pressed my hand against my mouth instantly, because that sounded exactly like him. Practical. Quiet. Loving in ways small enough to miss unless you paid attention carefully. Tears burned my eyes for the first time since the funeral, but I forced them back down before they could fall. Martin watched me silently for several seconds. Then his expression shifted subtly. More urgent now. Margaret, he said carefully, has anyone asked you to sign documents yet? Not yet. They will. His voice sharpened slightly. And when they do, you must sign nothing. Absolutely nothing. Do you understand? I nodded slowly. Outside, tires crunched suddenly across the wet gravel driveway. My head turned instantly toward the front window. A silver SUV pulled into view beneath the rain-darkened trees. Vanessa and Daniel were home. Martin stood immediately. Do not tell them I came here, he said quietly while gathering the documents back into his briefcase. Not yet. My pulse had started pounding now, but strangely, fear no longer dominated it. Clarity did. Because for the first time since Edward died, I finally understood something completely. My husband did not leave me unprotected. He left me prepared. Vanessa walked into the house smiling. That was the first thing I noticed after Martin left through the side entrance near the garage. Not relief. Not grief. Satisfaction. The kind people wear when they believe events are finally moving in their favor. Rainwater still clung to the sleeves of her cream-colored trench coat while Daniel followed, several steps behind carrying shopping bags neither of them truly needed. His shoulders looked heavier than they had even a week ago. He reminded me suddenly of a man walking deeper into water while pretending not to notice the rising level around him. You should have called us, Vanessa said lightly as she set her purse onto the hallway table. We could have picked up groceries for you. Groceries. As though she had not already scheduled my removal from the house like furniture being prepared for storage. I folded the kitchen towel calmly between my hands. I managed. Her eyes scanned my face carefully, then drifted subtly toward Edward's office door behind me. Closed now. Locked again. I wondered if she noticed anything different in the room after Martin's visit. If manipulative people developed instincts for hidden danger the same way prey animals sense storms before they arrived. Daniel carried the bags toward the kitchen without speaking. Vanessa followed him slowly. We stopped by Silver Oak while we were out, she said casually over her shoulder. Just to gather information. I almost admired the persistence. The confidence. She no longer hid the plan because she believed control was inevitable now. How thoughtful, I replied quietly. She paused briefly at my tone but recovered quickly. You would actually love the grounds there. They have a gardening club. Gardening club. Edward built me a greenhouse with his own hands 20 years ago because I once mentioned missing fresh tomatoes during winter. He spent 3 straight weekends installing irrigation pipes beneath July heat until his shirt stuck to his back with sweat. A gardening club sounded insulting in comparison. But I smiled faintly instead. I already have a garden. Vanessa opened the refrigerator without answering. The silence between us had changed now. No longer confusion. No longer suspicion. We both understood exactly what the other person represented. Across the kitchen, Daniel unpacked groceries mechanically while avoiding eye contact again. Milk, bread, sparkling water, bananas. Strange how ordinary life continued moving through tragedy regardless of what rotted beneath it. Mom, Daniel said suddenly, still staring into the refrigerator, Vanessa and I were thinking maybe tomorrow we should all sit down together and discuss practical next steps. Practical. Another one of their words. Clean. Bloodless. Designed to turn betrayal into logistics. Practical for whom? I asked softly. Daniel finally looked at me then. Exhaustion sat heavily beneath his eyes now. But there was irritation too. Defensive irritation. Nobody is trying to hurt you. No, I replied quietly. You are just trying to relocate me before your father's headstone is even installed. Vanessa shut the refrigerator door harder than necessary. Tiny crack in composure. That is unfair. Is it? My voice remained calm. That seemed to unsettle her more each day. People expecting emotional collapse become nervous when they encounter patience instead. Vanessa folded her arms tightly. Margaret, this house is worth nearly $1.4 million. Maintaining it alone is unrealistic. There it was. Finally spoken plainly. Not grief. Not caregiving. Value. Property. Numbers. Edward always said desperation eventually made dishonest people careless. I leaned lightly against the kitchen counter studying her carefully. Interesting, I said softly. You suddenly know the exact value of my house. Daniel looked sharply toward Vanessa. Just for a second, panic flickered between them both. Tiny. Fast. But real. Vanessa recovered first. Real estate values are public information. Another lie. Because I recognized the exact figure from the hidden property evaluations inside the dining room box earlier that afternoon. She had already been planning sale projections months ago. Of course, I answered calmly. Upstairs, the old grandfather clock chimed 4 times through the quiet house. Edward used to rewind that clock every Sunday evening while humming old jazz melodies under his breath. He claimed routines kept a house alive. Looking around my kitchen now, I finally understood what he meant. Homes did not die when people passed away. They died when love was replaced by calculation. Vanessa moved toward the sink, adjusting the diamond bracelet again. My bracelet. She wore it constantly now. Ownership through repetition. I know this transition feels sudden, she said carefully, but eventually difficult decisions have to be made. Transition. Again that word. I watched rain sliding slowly down the kitchen windows behind her. You keep speaking as though my life already belongs to someone else, I replied quietly. Silence settled instantly. Daniel rubbed his forehead again. Mom, no, I interrupted softly. I would really like to understand something. I looked directly at Vanessa now. When exactly did you start planning this? Her expression hardened visibly for the first time since Edward died. Not grief. Not concern. Annoyance. Because predators dislike direct light. I have no idea what you're implying. Really? I tilted my head slightly. Then perhaps you can explain the nursing home intake forms completed before the funeral. Daniel froze completely beside the counter. Vanessa's face lost color instantly. Good. Let her feel uncertainty for once. You went through my purse, she snapped. There it was. Not denial. Deflection. Edward would have noticed it immediately. Interesting response, I said softly. Most innocent people start by denying wrongdoing. Daniel stepped forward quickly. Enough. His voice cracked sharply through the kitchen, startling all of us, even himself. Heavy silence followed immediately afterward. I stared at my son carefully. He looked frightened now. Truly frightened. Not of me. Of collapse. Of truth surfacing faster than expected. Vanessa touched his arm immediately. Daniel, but he pulled away slightly this time. Tiny movement. Barely visible. Yet important. Did you know about the paperwork? I asked him quietly. He said nothing. His silence answered loudly enough. My chest tightened painfully. Not because he helped plan it. Because he lacked the courage to stop it. Weakness damages families differently than cruelty does. Cruel people attack directly. Weak people stand quietly nearby while damage unfolds around them. Vanessa's voice sharpened suddenly. "We are trying to protect your future." "No," I answered calmly. "You are trying to finance yours." The room went completely still. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Somewhere upstairs, pipes groaned faintly inside the walls. Vanessa stared at me with open hostility now. The performance had finally cracked apart completely. "You have no idea what you are talking about." $283,000, I said quietly. Her face went white. Daniel turned sharply toward her. "What?" Too late. The words had already escaped into the room between us. Vanessa's breathing changed instantly. Faster now. Uneven. "You searched through our private information," she whispered. There it was again. No denial. Only panic over exposure. Daniel looked genuinely stunned. "Vanessa, what is she talking about?" She turned toward him too quickly. "It is complicated." Complicated. Another polished little word covering uglier truths beneath it. I watched my son carefully then. Confusion spread slowly across his face, while realization struggled painfully underneath it. "You told me the condo refinancing was temporary," he said quietly. Vanessa grabbed his arm again. "Not now." "How much debt are we actually in?" His voice sounded hollow. "Lost." For the first time since Edward died, Vanessa looked uncertain. Truly uncertain. Because secrets survive best in darkness, and suddenly light had entered the room too quickly for her to control. I said nothing further. I simply picked up my coffee cup and walked slowly toward the living room while thunder rolled faintly outside again. Behind me, their whispers started immediately. Tense. Fast. Fracturing. Edward was right about one thing above all else. People always reveal themselves eventually. You simply have to remain calm long enough to watch it happen. The house became quieter after that dinner conversation, but it was not the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the strained silence people create when they realize too many truths have entered the room too quickly. For the next 2 days, Vanessa barely spoke to me unless absolutely necessary. When she did, her voice sounded clipped and careful now, stripped of the soft, artificial warmth she had performed since Edward's funeral. Daniel looked worse each morning. He stopped shaving regularly. Dark circles deepened beneath his eyes. Twice I caught him sitting alone on the back porch staring toward Edward's greenhouse with the lost expression of someone beginning to understand how badly his life had drifted off course. But even then, he still said nothing. Weakness often hides behind silence because silence allows people to delay responsibility. On Thursday morning, I woke before sunrise and sat alone in the kitchen holding the silver flash drive between both hands while coffee brewed softly behind me. The house still slept upstairs. Pale blue dawn light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the countertops Edward built himself. I stared at the flash drive for several long minutes before finally standing and retrieving my old laptop from the living room cabinet. My pulse remained steady somehow. Fear had faded now. In its place sat something colder. Readiness. I plugged the drive into the laptop carefully. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then a single folder appeared on the screen. Edward. My throat tightened instantly. I clicked it open. Inside were dozens of files. Financial records. Scanned legal documents. Property protections. Voice recordings. Videos. One file stood apart from the rest. If you are watching this, something went wrong. My hand trembled only slightly before clicking play. Edward appeared on the screen sitting right here in this kitchen wearing his dark green flannel shirt, the one with the missing button near the collar he refused to replace because he claimed it was still perfectly good. The video quality looked grainy, probably recorded on his old tablet. For several seconds, he simply stared quietly into the camera, as though struggling to begin. Then he sighed softly. "Hello, Maggie." Hearing his voice again nearly broke me apart. I pressed one hand tightly against my mouth to stop the sound rising in my throat. Edward smiled sadly through the screen. "If you are watching this, I am probably gone already. And if Martin gave this to you, then my fears were justified." Fears. Not suspicions anymore. Fears. Edward leaned back slowly in his chair. He looked tired in the recording. Older somehow. The illness had already begun wearing him down more than he admitted publicly. "I need you to listen carefully," he continued, "because there are things I did not tell you while I was alive." Outside the windows behind the laptop screen, summer sunlight glowed across the garden. It must have been recorded weeks before his heart attack. "Vanessa has been pressuring Daniel about money for over a year," Edward said quietly. "At first I believed it was ordinary financial stress. Young families struggle sometimes. But eventually I realized something else was happening." I stared motionless at the screen. Upstairs, faint footsteps moved briefly overhead before silence returned again. Edward continued speaking carefully, deliberately. 3 months ago, I discovered Vanessa attempted to access trust information through Martin's office without authorization. When confronted indirectly, she lied. Daniel defended her immediately. He paused briefly, rubbing one tired hand across his forehead. That was when I understood Daniel was no longer thinking clearly. My chest ached listening to him say it aloud. Not angry. Not bitter. Just disappointed in the quiet, devastated way only fathers can be disappointed in sons they still love anyway. Edward looked directly into the camera then. "Maggie, I know you will want to believe Daniel did not understand what was happening. Maybe that is true. Maybe it is not. But weakness can damage people just as badly as cruelty when fear enters the room." Tears finally slid silently down my face then. Because that sounded exactly like Edward. Calm even while heartbroken. Honest without becoming cruel. The video continued. "I changed everything legally 2 months ago. The house, the trusts, the financial protections. Nobody can force you out unless you choose it willingly." Relief moved through me so sharply it almost hurt. Edward reached forward slightly toward the camera then, as though trying to sit closer to me across time itself. "But listen carefully now. Vanessa will not stop easily once she realizes access is blocked. Desperate people become reckless." Upstairs, a door closed softly. My pulse quickened immediately. They were awake now. I lowered the laptop volume quickly while keeping my eyes fixed on Edward's face. "You notice things other people miss," he said quietly. "That has always been your strength. Do not let anyone convince you otherwise just because grief makes you vulnerable. Vulnerable. Not weak. Never weak." Edward smiled faintly then. "And one more thing. There is a second document hidden where only you would think to look." I leaned closer instantly. "The greenhouse," he said softly. "Behind the cedar seed cabinet." The video ended abruptly afterward. Just static silence filling the screen. I sat frozen for several long seconds while morning light slowly brightened around me. The greenhouse. Edward spent nearly every spring morning there before breakfast watering seedlings while old jazz music played through the portable radio he kept hanging beside the workbench. If he hid something there, he wanted only me to find it because the greenhouse belonged to us together. Not to Daniel. Not to Vanessa. Us. Footsteps moved downstairs suddenly. I closed the laptop immediately just as Vanessa entered the kitchen wearing silk pajamas beneath a cream robe. She stopped instantly when she saw me already dressed. "You are awake early again," she said. Carefully. Her eyes dropped toward the closed laptop beside my coffee cup. "Could not sleep," I replied calmly. Vanessa moved toward the coffee machine slowly. Watching me. Measuring. "Daniel and I were thinking maybe we should invite a financial advisor over this weekend," she said lightly. "Just to help organize things after Edward's passing." Organize things. I almost smiled. She had no idea the ground beneath her plans was already collapsing. "That will not be necessary," I answered quietly. Vanessa's hand paused halfway toward the coffee filters. Tiny reaction. "Why not?" I looked directly at her then. Calmly. "Because Edward already organized everything before he died." Silence spread instantly through the kitchen. Heavy. Sharp. Dangerous. Vanessa's face changed almost imperceptibly, but enough. Fear flickered there for the first time openly. Real fear. Not irritation. Not frustration. Fear. Good. Let her feel uncertain now too. She recovered quickly, forcing another smile. Of course he did. But her voice sounded thinner suddenly. Brittle. Upstairs, I heard Daniel moving around their room while pipes groaned softly through the walls. Outside the kitchen windows, sunlight spilled across Edward's greenhouse standing quietly near the edge of the garden. And for the first time since his funeral, I understood something completely. Edward was still protecting me. Even now,